So, hello everyone, my name is Kate and I am the founder of Journey to Joy Coaching, which is a nutrition business. My main focus now is on nutrition, but I am also a qualified herbalist, life coach, fitness professional, quite a lot of things to be honest. I also have a sideline in making natural skincare, the relevance of which is that skin health is one of my particular specialisms. And I have been through a personal journey with this myself, with numerous autoimmune conditions, which particularly came out in unpleasant skin rashes, which is one of those very annoying things we dismiss as terribly trivial. It actually isn't necessarily, because when your skin is itching so much you can't concentrate on anything, it can actually be quite debilitating, and I know this from personal experience. All of which, you know, having been passed from doctor to doctor and told that they've no idea what's wrong. Incidentally, exactly the same thing happened with my mother as well. And ultimately, it was largely down to food, which is why I do really, focus on the sort of the importance of diet. But I like to take a very holistic approach with clients, so I do obviously look at all of these factors. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about skin nutrition, which might sound like a very strange, sort of very niche subject, but bear with me. Even if you don't think you particularly have, skin problems, as I say, bear with me and this will make sense. So why I focus on skin of all things? Well, the really interesting thing about your skin is essentially it can act as a visible manifestation of the health of your overall body. Because it is an organ, it's an organ system, it's our largest organ system, but unlike the rest of our so-called vital organs, we can't, we can actually see it. So, the skin is very important, it does a lot of important jobs in its own right. It's a huge organ of elimination, it's a barrier function, it stops us from getting all sorts of horrendous toxins that we're exposed to from getting in. As I say, very, very important in its own right. However, in terms of our body's priorities, if we are lacking in particular nutrients, often the signs of that are going to show up on the skin first, because your body's going to prioritise giving the nutrients to something like your brain or your heart before your skin. So an example of this is if we can see that our skin is becoming dehydrated, well, that means our body is dehydrated. That means overall we're not taking in enough water, or perhaps we're not getting enough omega-3 fatty acids or so on. We can look at these nutrient deficiencies, but we can see them on our skin. And what that also means is we can see when we're making positive changes, which is very motivating. We can't see when our brain is dehydrated until we get very serious health problems. But if we can address it in the skin first, then we can prevent those problems from happening. And talking about dehydration, that sort of brings me on to a point I want to mention, because a lot of people think skin health is found in a bottle of moisturiser, usually very expensive moisturiser incidentally, and that is simply not true. And I say this as somebody who actually makes and sells skincare products, so I wouldn't be saying that if it wasn't the case. Skincare products are wonderful, when used correctly, and they absolutely are a factor that, I do consider, certainly with clients, because what's interesting is the wrong kind of skincare products absolutely can do damage to your skin. You can have estrogenic compounds in there, xenoestrogens, all sorts of endocrine disruptors find their way into skincare, and that we absolutely do not want. Also, some synthetic chemicals are so strong that they can start to penetrate deeper, into that skin. We don't want that. However, for the most part, since one of your skin's functions is to act as a barrier, skincare products, they're great aesthetically, sitting on the surface of your skin, but that's all they're really doing. They can clean your skin, they can moisturise a tiny bit of the sort of upper layers, but what they can do is incredibly limited in terms of making, lasting fundamental changes to your skin structure. And you know, we have a tendency to think of the skin as being, well, dead. We're often told that. But actually, it's only the very outer layers of the skin that we see that are dead. We have an awful lot more living skin cells, and in fact, if we look at the deeper layers of our skin, every skin cell, you know, and the same in your nails as well, and in your hairs, is fed by its own individual blood vessel. It has specialist channels just to funnel water to it. That is because it still has a need for nutrients. And that means that we absolutely can affect the health of the skin from what we put into our bodies. Now, it does take a little bit of time for us to see that, because it's going to take a while for those skin cells to reach the outer layers that we see. But, as I say, ultimately, we can see it. If we want to check the health of, you know, internal organs and so on, that's going to involve a lot more complex testing, and, you know, sometimes it can be very, very difficult to actually find out, you know, if we're doing the right thing. But with our skin, we've got a really clear indication just by looking in the mirror. Okay, so in terms of how, you know, nutrition and all of these other holistic factors affect skin health, obviously it's a huge topic, and I could go on and on and on at some length, especially because I do get very over enthusiastic. So I have just picked a single example to focus on. And this is something that affects absolutely everyone, and that is skin aging. Now, I don't want it to be sort of misunderstood. Obviously, there is a lot of, you know, almost stigma around aging, you know, youth being associated with beauty, and, you know, I'm very much against that, and against, you know, so yeah, we all support this idea of the positive aging, because aging is a natural process, and at the end of the day, we cannot reverse it entirely. Of course, we are going to get wrinkles. But what a lot of people don't realise is that actually your skin, it's not a natural process that it completely shrivels up, dries out, gets age spots, and all of these things that we associate with age. Or at least, if these things do happen, they should happen very slowly, and really, you can be quite old before they are sort of significant. And ultimately, all of this aging that we see on our skin, an awful lot of what we think of as just inevitable extrinsic aging factors, they're actually preventable. Because what that is showing you is, it is showing you damage to your skin. Damage which can be avoided. And to some extent, we can also, you know, we can use diet and lifestyle changes to actually start to reverse some of those sort of signs of damage as well. So yes, we do have a certain element of what we call intrinsic aging, where, you know, the body's functions kind of slow down as we age. We know that this happens. But then we also have huge numbers of things that, you know, external to ourselves, which will affect the skin. And as I say, it's important to remember all the time I'm talking about the skin, I'm not just talking about the skin. So if we think of all of the other things that we think of as being almost inevitable with aging, like cancer and dementia and heart disease and all of these things, again, you know, a huge percentage of cases of these things are preventable. So again, if we're improving the health of our skin, we're also lowering our risk of all kinds of degenerative diseases. So what are some of the things we can look at then with aging? So diet obviously is a huge factor. And there's some different ways of looking at this. So for starters, there's what we call the overall dietary pattern. Now, it's probably not going to come as news to anyone if I say that a dietary pattern that includes a daily McDonald's is not exactly healthy for the skin. Overall, what is sometimes called the sort of Western diet, it's often known a bit ethnocentrically as the standard American diet, but I do actually like that because the acronym obviously is SAD, which kind of sums up how you tend to feel eating it, because it absolutely does contribute to depression. And that is largely due to the connection with your microbiome, which is a whole other rabbit hole that we're not going to go down today. But whatever you want to call that dietary pattern. And what we mean by that is it's characterised by things like, a huge proportion of processed food, especially ultra processed foods, so the so-called junk foods, but also just things that people often don't think of as junk food, like bread, those kinds of things, all the pastas, the heavily refined grains, and so consequently a real lack of fibre because all the carbohydrates are being processed to death, lack of fresh fruit and vegetables. Omega-3 and omega-6 is totally off balance, so we're having all these omega-6 oils and virtually no omega-3, also huge amounts of hydrogenated, those trans fats, very, very bad, because your body just doesn't know what to do with them. Also things like dehydration from lack of water, over-reliance on caffeine, alcohol, stimulants like that. So all of these kinds of features of the diet versus a diet that is based on real whole foods and largely plant-based or entirely. So it's, I say, probably not surprising that very sad diet, that is hugely linked with aging versus whole, real, plant-based foods, which is very much linked with the opposite. So there are a whole load of reasons why this is. It's something that often gets sort of stated like, well, yes, junk food's bad for you, without really exploring, the reasoning behind it. But to be honest, we could be here all day talking about the reasons behind it. Just a very few of them, to take some examples, would be something like oxidation, for example. Now, oxidation is a natural process which takes place in the body all of the time. Your natural, sort of as your cells are metabolizing, they produce what we call free radicals, a reactive oxygen species. And because oxygen is a very volatile molecule, it goes around sort of stealing electrons, and ultimately it damages cells in your body. Now, we can't really stop that from happening because it is just a natural process, but a diet that is rich in whole plant-based foods, so your fresh fruits and vegetables, they are all very rich in antioxidants. Antioxidants, obviously, will help to protect us against the oxidation. They can repair that damage. If we don't have enough of those, then the oxidative damage is increased. And so many of the sort of degenerative conditions that we associate with aging have been linked to oxidation. So if you're looking to increase the antioxidants in your diet, what you really want to focus on is, as I say, more fresh fruits and vegetables. And the ideal way to do this is, rather than thinking about all the things you've got to cut out, because that can get quite a negative mindset, is to focus on what you can put into your diet. So the more fresh fruits and vegetables you eat, ideally what we want to do is we crowd the junk out. Because if you can start to basically fill up on fresh fruits and vegetables, what that does is it starts to reset your taste buds, essentially. It will start to really help with that microbiome. And that is a really fundamental thing, which, as I say, I'm not going to talk too much about that whole area just because it's such a massive area and I could go off on such a tangent. But I really like to just put this out there because a lot of people get a bit, oh, I've never thought about it like that. But, it's, depending on which source you read, it's sort of 80 to 90% of the cells in your body are not actually human. They're not actually you at all. What they are the microbes. You have them everywhere, but in particular in our gut, we have huge diversity in there, or at least we should have. Now, what's really interesting is, those microbes have co-evolved with us going back sort of billions of years. So it's highly surprising that they have a communication system going on. And when you think about, okay, so the vast majority of serotonin makes you happy, that's produced in your gut. It's no coincidence that when we're eating well, when our digestion is functioning well, we feel happy because our microbes are happy. Without them being happy, we can't feel happy because we cannot actually manufacture that serotonin. Equally, so many of our cravings, you get people blaming themselves for a lack of willpower, but actually, so many of our cravings, that's not actually you. That is being hijacked by Often it can be things like an overgrowth of like yeast, various types of bacteria that crave sugar, for example. So if you've got this constant craving for sugar, often what that actually is a disturbance in the microbiome. That's what's craving the sugar. So once we start to eat more and more of those foods that we all know are healthy, what's great is that feeds the so-called good bacteria in our gut. Well, they also can trigger cravings. So you are more likely to actually start craving, the good foods, and then you won't want to eat the bad ones. So that's more how we want to go about it. And of course, it's not an overnight fix. You can't eat a fruit salad and then think, brilliant, I'm never going to crave donuts again. So that we have to be sensible about it. And of course, it's going to take time. But the good news is, these habits can sort of stack on each other, and it really does help to improve your overall well-being, and that can be really, really motivating. So in terms of antioxidants, what we really want to focus on is those bright colours. The more bright colours, the better, and ideally what we want to do is we want to eat the rainbow. So we talk about a beauty rainbow skin nutrition. And that's just because different coloured fruits and vegetables, that means they've got different pigments in, and those pigments are linked to different phytochemicals. So we've got some wonderful, examples of those, which I will talk about a little bit later in this video. But just to finish up on some other little elements of the aging, how our diet is sort of contributing to that. So we talked about the overall dietary pattern, one of the problems being a lack of antioxidants. Another problem is actually something that often isn't talked about, which is cooking methods. So if we're using a lot of very high fat and high heat combined, in particular, cooking methods, so things like roasting, barbecuing, absolute worst one, deep frying things obviously is not great, but frying at all, at any sort of high temperatures, one of the things that's doing is actually creating the wonderfully named advanced glycation end products, which is a brilliant idea because, of course, we can obviously see what the acronym spells. And it's true, they do age you. Now, some foods are higher in these to start with than others. Generally speaking, any animal-based foods are incredibly high in them. But of course, that's compounded by the fact that they also have to be cooked at high temperature before they can be rendered not poisonous. So what you're left with is an aging cocktail in there, as opposed to fruits and vegetables, which contain negligible amounts of these AGEs, and often we can eat them raw, so we're not adding anything to them. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't cook your food. I'm not saying you have to go on one of these sort of raw diets. In particular, if you're talking lots of, those leafy green vegetables, which are very, very good for you, but unfortunately humans don't actually possess the ability to break down cellulose, which means you're either going to chew your greens to death, which would be very, very healthy, but the reality is none of us really do, or we can blitz them up in a smoothie, or we're going to need to cook them. But something like light steaming is ideal. A steamer is really, really easy to buy. Or just, these gentle cooking methods. And ideally, if we can cook things, we can use just a little bit of water instead of using all of that oil. That really, really helps with the anti-aging idea of our food. So that's the sort of overall overarching things that we can do. And then, as I say, there's very specific foods that we can focus on. And as I say, yes, all of that processed food and everything, definitely it's got to go. But I like to focus on, as I say, more what we can add in. So we're looking at the sort of the positive subtraction, if you like. We're going to crowd out the junk with all of the good stuff. And in particular, in terms of your sort of anti-aging superstars, what you're really looking at, mostly is the fruit. And vegetables, of course, are important as well. But some absolute superstars in the anti-aging world that I just want to quickly mention are things like, so absolute, got to be number one, which I always talk about, is red grapes. And a lot of people look a bit surprised. Oh, okay, that's a bit boring. Absolutely not. Now, if you've ever heard, you might have heard it mentioned because it became quite famous at one point because I think people just liked the idea of it, that red wine is anti-aging because it's an antioxidant, and it caused a bit of a, one of these sort of media things a little while ago, and then it just sort of died away. Yeah, there was a slight flaw in that sort of conclusion. Technically, yes, because red wine being made from red grapes, yes, it does contain resveratrol. Unfortunately, the amount of red wine that you would have to drink to get an actual, significant benefit from the resveratrol would give you enough alcohol to give you alcohol poisoning. So, I'm not totally convinced by that argument, to be honest. On the other hand, there is no known sort of upper tolerance level for red grapes. So you can eat as many red grapes as you like, and therefore you can get lots and lots of lovely resveratrol. Resveratrol is absolutely fantastic because it's an antioxidant. It fights off the glycation. It affects sort of telomere length because we know that shortening telomeres also ages. To be honest, if there's any kind of aging effect, and actually with my clients and one of my programs I do, which is the Facelift Diet Coach program, because I'm a licensed Facelift Diet Coach. In that program we actually look at 12 aging pathways specifically, and we do a whole analysis on that, basically looking at, okay, which ones do we really need to focus on? What is your diet really triggering? But yeah, I love red grapes because no matter what aging pathway you're looking at, it always comes up, oh, it's resveratrol, that can sort that out. It's absolutely wonderful. So yeah, great. Also, one of the many things that helps with the UV damage to the skin. So, some of the other ones that I absolutely love are talking about things like lycopene, which you find generally that's in your sort of red fruits, so things like watermelon and tomatoes. That again has been shown to counteract UV damage in the skin. Again, absolutely fantastic compound, super good for you. Tomatoes are also on the list of sort of microbiome superfoods because again there is a huge sort of gut connection with all of this. There is with everything, because ultimately in nutrition you can eat all the most wonderful food in the world, but if you can't absorb it properly because your gut is not functioning properly, then we're wasting our time. So we always have to come back to looking at gut health as part of all of this. So yes, there are so many other wonderful things I could talk about. The quercetin in apples, onions, curcumin in turmeric, wonderful anti-inflammatory compound. Cetin in strawberries. I mean, there are just so many wonderful things that I could go on, but I'd bore you to death. So, but suffice to say, looking at those bright coloured, fruits and vegetables, and if we can eat, as I say, trying to get all those colour groups in. So there's so many sort of red fruits that we can eat, and then we look at the sort of the orange and the yellow group, all of those. Green, obviously, there are so many green vegetables, and we know that they're good for us. The blue and purple bit confuses people a bit, but we stretch the colour wheel a little bit there. So yes, blueberries do count, blackberries, blackcurrants, all of those things. Also some things like beetroots and things you can sort of count as purple and red, It's a movable feast, that one. But yeah, as I say, just try and get as much different variety in as possible. And, always focus on, as I say, the real foods. Lovely little analogy that I like to give about this is, if an alien was coming down to planet Earth, they didn't know what food was, and then we're going to find out, could they just take a guidebook, like a sort of forager's guidebook, look at what you're eating and then go out and find it in the world and recognise it? Because if they couldn't, you may want to think twice about eating it. So that is my little rule of thumb when people think, well, what counts as a real whole food? Well, if an alien can't recognise it, it's probably not. Okay, so as I said, nutrition is the foundation for everything that we look at with skin health. But because I am, very much a proponent of the holistic method, I just wanted to run through a few other things that you may not have thought about impacting on your skin health. So the next obvious one to talk about is exercise, or as I like to call it, sort of movement. Because we're not just talking about, going to the gym per se, which is great, by the way, if you enjoy it. There's lots of other different ways that you can get exercise in, but also it's just the general moving about, So one of the specific skin issues that I hear a lot of women of a certain age talking about is, for example, cellulite. Now, cellulite is one of those controversial subjects because there are unfortunately actually still some doctors who deny that it exists, which is interesting. It overwhelmingly does affect women. It occasionally occurs in men, but it's extremely rare. And unfortunately, very limited studies have actually been done into what causes it. We know that estrogen plays a part in it because it almost exclusively affects women, but we don't really understand how that works. But some of the things we do know that we can do about it, and one of those is we know that a sedentary lifestyle does make it worse, and you all often see that. So one of the most common places that women get cellulite is sort of on the backs of the thighs and that kind of area. Because if they're seated for a long time, obviously all your blood is pooling in that area, and we know that that contributes to it. So one of the things that we can do is to just get up, move about. If you're in an office job or something like that, you can't always help the fact that you need to sit for long periods of time. But, any excuse to just get up, go to the photocopier, go for a little walk is really, really great. Incidentally, another thing that's great with cellulite is that sort of, skin brushing or massages, things like that, to try and move the sort of, get the lymph moving around in your lymphatic system, which has been shown to help. Also beetroots. I just wanted to throw that out there. Those sort of nitrates, really, really good for it as well. That's something we do know that we can do with the diet. But in terms of other sort of lifestyle things that we have to look at, I mentioned earlier about skincare. It's not necessarily the solution to the problem, but it can sometimes be part of the problem. So if we are using very harsh synthetic chemicals, of course we have a microbiome on our skin, and what that's doing is it's totally disrupting it. So you see this unfortunately most commonly in people, for example, with severe acne, and they're sort of told, well, you've got to get the oil off your skin, so we use really harsh cleansers. That is absolutely the worst thing that you can do for acne, because the natural sebum on your skin, one of the things it's doing is it's forming part of your acid mantle, and that is what is killing bacteria. Also, the bacteria that should be living on your skin, because we live in a symbiotic relationship with them, now they need that kind of acidic environment and that oil there to live in. As soon as we strip that oil off, our skin is completely exposed to all of the bacteria, all of the microbes in the air. Well, there's trillions of them, and they're landing all over your skin. You've killed off all of the good bacteria, and you've got no defense against it. So obviously, your skin panics and tries to produce more oil, obviously, to get that back, but you've also got now an onslaught of bacteria. So there's no way you're going to cure acne that way. So yes, in terms of skincare products, obviously I always recommend natural products. Natural, unfortunately, is a poorly defined word. It's not regulated anywhere in the world that I know of. So yeah, I have obviously, because as I say, I do make natural skincare, and it is natural, and that means it's made from plants. And so obviously I have made plenty of other videos, you can check out my YouTube channel for those, discussing the meanings of all of this. But yeah, there are so many great brands out there, but I'm talking sort of indie brands. So really look at, small creators in your area, because that's where you're going to find natural skincare products. Do not be swayed by marketing claims. You will see all of the huge cosmetics companies will, proudly tell you, this has got aloe vera in it. Yes, it's got, it's 0.05% of aloe vera in a cocktail of synthetic chemicals. That's not going to do anything. Do not be swayed by these ridiculous marketing claims and greenwashing, please. So yeah, it's a really great way to support local businesses, because they are far more likely to be making actual natural products. It's just not something that the really big brands have caught up with yet, even if they do claim to. So some of the other sort of lifestyle factors that we want to look at, obviously there are huge numbers, and we could go on and on and on about this. Some obvious ones, I think we all know that smoking definitely ages your skin. I think we know that alcohol does. Interestingly, what alcohol has been particularly linked with is the little lines, which are the little lines that sort of come up in your forehead there. It's called the 11s, and that's been heavily linked with alcohol, incidentally. So have conditions like rosacea. So that is obviously that is one of the many factors. Sunlight is actually a really interesting one, which I like to mention because it surprises people. So we all know that too much sun exposure is very bad for our skin because we know that it causes skin cancer. Absolutely. It also it causes burning. We can see it damaging our skin before our very eyes. But what is actually really, really interesting is that we also need the sun to, amongst other things, prevent skin cancer. If you completely starve your skin of sunlight, you actually increase your chance of getting skin cancer. And that is simply because we do need that vitamin D. Now, vitamin D is an important component in our immune system. We're quite bad at absorbing vitamin D from food, so although we can get it that way, it's just not great. It's far better if we can make our own. And obviously, if our immune system is functioning poorly, one of the conditions that obviously linked with that is ultimately cancer. So, a little bit of sunlight actually is extremely good for everything, including the health of our skin. And unfortunately, one of the problems we have now is, we have people plastering themselves in sun lotion every time they go out in the sun. Now that, obviously, a lot of sun protection, products are, again, they're damaging the microbiome because of what's in them, but also they're not doing an adequate job. So if you live in a country where you've got very, very strong sunlight, again, there's still a risk, absolutely, of UV damage. But then in places where you get less sunlight, you can actually end up, getting not enough sunlight, and particularly obviously if you have darker skin and you're living somewhere like the UK, for example, which is quite a long way north, that is definitely going to lower the efficiency of the immune system. So these are things that we definitely have to look at. And the interesting thing is there are so many, again, fruits and vegetables that have been linked with giving us that UV protection. So again, we can boost the effectiveness of the skin, what's it called, the sun cream when we need it. So, for example, if you're living somewhere where it's very, very sunny. But then equally, obviously, we do want to make sure that we are getting our 10 minutes of sunlight, particularly if you're in a country like this one, and potentially looking at some supplementation over the winter, because we do need that, again, that little bit of sunlight. So, as I say, I look at huge numbers of different factors in the in skin health. As I say, gut health is another massive one. There is such a link between that and obviously the health of our skin and the health of our whole body, because as I say, if we don't have a healthy gut, then we're not absorbing what we're eating anyway. So yeah, we're kind of set up for failure before we start. So we absolutely need to focus on the gut health. Hormones is another hugely important one. There are so many interesting connections there with skin health. So, for example, if you've ever heard it said, like people who are in love or pregnant, how their skin is sort of glowing. Well, interestingly enough, oxytocin, which is that hormone that, is the so-called love hormone, well, that actually does stimulate the production of new dermal fibroblasts. So, actually, yes, our skin is healthier when we have oxytocin. So there you go. Incidentally, if you don't have a partner and getting pregnant is not an option for you, stroking a cat would do just as well, or any kind of connection like that, or go and get a massage or that kind of thing. So there are lots of ways that we can get oxytocin, don't worry. There are also, you know, as I say, so many other hormones that we need to look at, keeping all of those in balance. Sleep is another huge one. Obviously, I think we all know if we don't get enough sleep, our skin obviously suffers. We get bags under our eyes, we get dark shadows. Well, we've all seen that. Those might be sort of temporary effects that a good night's sleep will then overcome. But obviously, fundamentally, yeah, sleep, huge component in our overall health. And some of the other things, obviously, I mentioned earlier dehydration. Dehydration obviously can be caused by, you know, just a lack of water, but of course, if we have dry skin conditions, that can be a lack of water. It can also be simply the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is off, because if we don't have enough omega-3s, our cells will have improperly formed membranes and they won't be able to hold on to that water. So again, it comes back to the diet. Another thing is simply light. You know, are we getting enough natural daylight when we should? And then of course on the flip side of that, you know, that exposure to blue light, that has been investigated by many researchers, and we know it is very bad for us. We also know that it's aging our skin. It's also throwing off our melatonin production, of course, which we all think of, oh, it's a sleep hormone. Well, yes it is. But have you ever noticed that melatonin is a little bit like the word melanin, which is the pigment in your skin and in your hair? Well, they are actually related. And actually, melatonin does all sorts of interesting things in your skin. And one of the things it actually does is it actually acts as an antioxidant. So, interestingly enough, we don't just need melatonin to fall asleep. So in conclusion, yes, it is a bit of a big topic. It can be a bit overwhelming, but what I would start with, because I want to give you just sort of one simple, actionable piece of advice that you can take away from this video, and that would be just eat more fruits and vegetables. Particularly those bright colours, and think about eating the sort of the beauty rainbow, because that is so important. And even if you can just have, you know, one habit that you can really put into your day, I would make it that one. But obviously, as I say, it is a whole picture, and it is usually complicated. So if you are feeling a little bit overwhelmed and you feel you might need a bit of support in this, then please do come and as I say, check out my website, which is jonesjoycoaching.co.uk. I also have an Instagram where I share all sorts of tips. You know, they're usually quick tips on nutrition, fitness, quick little workouts, things like that. I have a YouTube channel where I talk in some depth. In fact, you may be watching this video on it. Well, technically you are watching this video on it actually, but if you're watching it over on the Summit website, then obviously you can also click watch on YouTube, and that will take you to my YouTube channel. Otherwise, if you are watching it there, then you already know about that. So some of those videos I do talk, as I say, at some length about things. I also have little top tips videos, which I do, and sometimes I share those over on TikTok as well. I've just started doing that, so yeah, I don't really know what I'm doing with it. Oh, never mind. Yeah, where else can you find me? So I have a Facebook group, which you're very welcome to join. So yeah, over on my website I do also have all sorts of different little freebies, because I'm, I don't know, a nice person and I like sharing stuff. So I have all sorts of different things depending on what your jam is. So if you like sort of reading things, you know, I've got lots of guides, free guides that you can download. I also make lots of little bundles. So they're very, very cheap. They're only $4.99. But sometimes if I bring out a new one, I do actually put it up for free, just for a short time. So, you know, I've got a couple on there at the moment that you can grab quick. Or I have also put one in the free gifts for the Summit. So make sure you are signed up to the Summit, because you will find them there. And then I do also have a whole range of, as I say, my coaching programs. If you want to go really into depth with skin health, then I have a program for you. So do take a look at all of that. So yes, I hope you have enjoyed this video. A little whistle stop tour. I always feel when I get to end one of these videos like, but I've hardly talked about anything, I've hardly scratched the surface. Well, that's true. So do check out some of my other videos where we go more in depth on various topics. And you know, I'm always available. If you go on my website, there are also options to book a free you know, discovery call if you think that you might like to work with me further. So I hope to see you soon, either in my Facebook group or on a call or wherever it might take you. And yeah, I do hope that you also enjoy the rest of the summit. If you haven't signed up to that, do so. There is a link below this video. And I will see you all soon.